This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy and TNC chapters throughout the western United States. Guided by science and grounded by decades of collaborative partnerships, the Nature Conservancy has a long-standing legacy of achieving lasting results to create a world where nature and people thrive. On the last Tuesday of every month throughout 2024, Mountain and Prairie will be delving into conversations with a wide range of the Nature Conservancy's leaders, partners, collaborators, and stakeholders, highlighting the myriad of conservation challenges, opportunities, and solutions in the American West and beyond. To learn more about the Nature Conservancy's impactful work in the West and around the world, visit www.nature.org. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Dr. Emily Howe. Emily is an aquatic ecologist with the Washington State chapter of the Nature Conservancy, and she holds a Ph.D. from the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences at the University of Washington. Her work integrates across ecosystem boundaries, investigating how landscape configuration and management shape cross-boundary relationships for food webs, organisms, and ecosystem processes. At the Nature Conservancy, Emily's projects stretch from the high peaks of the North Cascades all the way down to the estuary of Port Susan Bay, and her work highlights the interconnectedness of everything from snowpack to salmon populations, from forest management to marsh grass health. Much of Emily's work focuses on understanding liminal spaces, areas in nature where boundaries blend together and where interactions between ecosystems can be dynamic and fluid. Since the earliest days of European settlement, this area has been subject to a wide variety of threats to the overall ecosystem: aggressive logging, wildfire suppression, attempts to engineer order in the ever-changing estuaries, and much more. And with the intensification of climate change, snowfall and its resulting snowpack have decreased, which only exacerbates the negative effects and threats to the ecosystem. But thanks to Emily and her team of stakeholders and partners, there are many, many reasons to be optimistic about the future. Combining cutting-edge science with indigenous knowledge, Emily and TNC are making great progress towards finding solutions that can help with everything from increasing the depth and duration of snowpack in the Cascades to restoring all-important salmon habitat. If you're a fan of ecology and are interested in how indigenous wisdom can bolster our 21st century scientific knowledge, then you'll love this episode. We start our conversation at sea level, discussing the magic of the tidal ecosystems. Then we work our way up into the mountains, eventually discussing all things snowpack and forest health. We talk about TNC's partnership with the Stille tribe, how forest gaps can affect snowpack, snow droughts and El Nino, collaboration with federal agencies, and rising sea levels in the Northwest. Emily also talks about her career path to becoming a scientist, and she offers up some excellent book recommendations. I love the Pacific Northwest, so I greatly appreciate everything that Emily and her partners are doing to keep this region of the West so wild, special, and healthy. I hope you enjoy it. All right, Emily. Well, we had a great conversation yesterday preparing for this thing, and it made me, I've just really enjoyed the preparation for this because, as we discussed, I did a semester with the National Outdoor Leadership School there in the Pacific Northwest, and a lot of the places we went are places where you're doing work. So I'm really excited for this conversation. I appreciate you taking the time. I was thinking kind of the best way we could structure this conversation is to kind of start at sea level and then work our way up. And so I know one of your big projects is the Port Susan Bay Preserve. I know you spend a lot of time working there. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind, just to kind of set the stage, if you could talk about the Port Susan Bay Preserve in that area and maybe give us kind of a brief history lesson of what that area was pre-European settlement, and then kind of how it changed over the years as Europeans came in and settled it.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked me to start at sea level because if I think of myself as a scientist, I started at sea level too and then
Yeah.
rose up into the mountains. So that's perfect. So Port Susan Bay is at the mouth of the Stillaguamish River. So, and it is an inlet of, one of many in the whole of the Salish Sea out on the Pacific coast in Washington state. And the Stillaguamish is one of maybe 16 major river systems that flow into the Salish Sea, and it actually is one of the ones that has lower headwaters than many of the others. So the Skagit, for example, has big glaciated systems. And the Nooksack, same thing with Mount Baker. But the Stille is a little bit lower elevation, and because of that, it's a much more climate vulnerable system than the ones that have glaciers in terms of more immediacy of like it heating up. So prior to European colonization, it was a big complex river. It at one point was connected to Glacier Peak, but there was a major landslide up in the headwaters of the basin, and it shifted the entire river so that Glacier Peak now drains down a whole different drainage system, and the Stille is a bit of a smaller one now. But it would have been, a huge complex of floodplain forest and side channels and oxbows all the way down from these snow-capped peaks in the heart of the Cascade Mountains. And it would have opened out into a broad tidal delta that would have had big spruce forests in the swamps that were tidal fresh. So the water level goes up and down. You get all these really complicated sort of channel pathways in through the woods. And then you think about all the complexity of the root structures, and all of that comes together. It would have just been a very complex habitat, both in terms of the water moving up and down, but the pockets of habitat spaces in all those root systems and under the branches that, young fish can find food and they can find refuge. And then that would have given way to sort of lower, willow type habitat. We call that scrub shrub tidal marshes, and then out into a broad estuarine emergent zone where you would have had sedges and rushes and cattails. And all throughout that, the river over millennia would have swept back and forth across that plain, that floodplain between sort of the higher bluffs. And there would have been just a maze of channels going all over the place. So really complex, always somewhere to be, microhabitats to choose from. And then from there, it gives way to this smooth expanse of mudflat in Port Susan Bay that eventually transitions to big, deep eelgrass beds before it drops off into the deep trough of the bay and Admiralty Inlet eventually. So it would have been this beautiful continuum, where you can't tell the difference really of when land turns to water, and now it's much more straitjacketed between levee walls.
And so when Europeans came in and started to settle and kind of change the landscape, was agriculture kind of the main driver behind, I guess, putting in levees, basically just trying to put some order into this extremely complex system that thrives on its complexity, but as has been shown over many all the history written, Europeans like to try to straighten stuff out. And so was that kind of the driver between that led to kind of where we are today?
Yeah, I think agriculture for sure, but also the floodplains and estuary and marsh areas were the only flat land to be had, really. It's a steep landscape, and so that makes settling difficult if you're not going to be down in the flatlands. And if you're going to be in the flatlands, you need to be prepared to be flooded out. And so kind of those two things together combine to kind of push, initially agriculture, eventually other forms of industry and shipping. And the dike out at Port Susan Bay that the Nature Conservancy owns and manages was originally put in, in the early 1900s or so by a Dutch settler. So, those guys they're good at building dikes, keeping water out of places. But even so, that particular, toe of property was so far out into the tidelands that they had a really hard time keeping it pumped out and the soil's dry. And so eventually we're sort of gave up because, if the pumps failed, the place filled up. And then, of course, as sea level rises, you get, not only can the dike be overtopped, but you can get water percolating up from below. So, and some of that can be salty now. So I think that it was a parcel of land. This particular piece is 150 acres that was right out at the toe of the Stille River, and it connects to another 4,000 acres of tidelands and marshes that the Nature Conservancy manages and owns. But this one little toe piece, really, it was tough to farm, to be sure. And it's also, because it's right connected to both the river and the bay, it is. We kind of talk a lot about keystone species in science, but I think of this as a keystone like location almost for a delta ecosystem. Any place where you can increase connectivity or block off that connectivity in this case between things that are supposed to flow, like the river to the tides, is a place where you can actually affect a lot of ecosystem change and process by either, if you block it off, but also if you focus on those areas for restoration.
Well, and so that brings me to my next question. It's obviously a very important ecosystem, but I would imagine that there are, there are somewhat similar areas up and down, if you go north and south through Washington, particularly in that area, there's tons of places that could use some attention. And so what specifically about the Port Susan Bay Preserve, that land, what caught the Nature Conservancy's attention? Why did they decide to devote their time and resources and brains to this particular piece of property?
Yeah, so they purchased that in 2001, I believe, which was the year I graduated college, and I was a summer intern for them that year. We started doing plant surveys, but I was not part of the 20 years prior to that purchase point that they had been working with that particular landowner, talking about trying to recover, really river floodplains and tidal deltas and this particular site is really important for the Pacific flyway for migrating shorebirds. And so initially at that point in time, they were thinking about shorebird protection because Chinook salmon weren't listed under the Endangered Species Act until 1996. So, the 20 years of work that was going into the purchase of this land and the protection of it, really actually what didn't start out thinking about salmon. They were part of the ecosystem. We knew that it was important for them, but we didn't know as much as we know today about how critical estuary deltas are for their survival and growth. So really it was the birds that were the primary goal of supporting their journey along the Pacific Flyway. And all of those mudflats are just teeming with shorebirds, feeding on all the, benthic diatoms, polychaete worms, little amphipods, small little clams called macoma. They're this little pink guys about the size of your thumbnail. And so they fatten up in those flats. And that was the initial impetus. So it's interesting when you start in a landscape, how your focus can change over time, depending on what the context is around you.
Yeah. And so fast forward to today, or let's say maybe the last 4 or 5 years, what has been your main focus there? Like how have you kind of measured your progress in working on this particular ecosystem?
I think the way I would measure my progress is by how well I can reconnect things that once were, and how well I can take stiff, hard boundaries and dissolve them into smooth transitions. So when you can no longer tell what's land and what's water, then maybe I've done my job well. So I think, my dissertation work at the University of Washington and the School of Fisheries was looking at these cross ecosystem food web subsidies. So when does, an organism out in the bay actually derive its energy from terrestrial matter or marsh, detritus from all those sedges that grow up every year and then die back down to the mud flat surface in the winter, and all that organic matter gets sucked up by the tridivores and eventually makes its way up through the food web. And at certain times, it's the kelps and the algae that are supporting the organisms who are up in the marsh, and at other times it's the marsh that's subsidizing everybody out in the mud flat. And so it's this constant shift and pulse. These are pulse ecosystems. So they don't always operate in one direction, and they don't always operate at the same magnitude all the time. And so trying to restore the Port Susan Bay property, we took a system that, had been returned to tidal connection in 2012, but there were only 2 connection points, and there wasn't a tidal channel network that went into this little pocket of 150 acre former farmland. So it kind of just like things went in, things went out, things went in, things went out, but they didn't flow through because it wasn't connected to the river. And so fish had to go an extra mile or so out of their way to even find the entrance to it. Once they got in there, the channel systems were pretty shallow, so they couldn't stay there for much of the tidal cycle. And so the time available for connection was diminished. And I think there's different philosophies around how we should be going about restoration of this world right now. I think one philosophy is we need to get as many restoration projects in as we possibly can because we're in such a damaged, dire state. Just get them in. And then there's another part of saying like, well, some of the big complex ones in the most sought after types of lands, which are these floodplains, deltas, because they are flat and they're productive, right? Maybe they need to operate at gold standard because it's so hard. You're just not going to get very many of them because the land doesn't come up for sale more than once every couple generations. And so that was sort of the take that we took on this one, which is like we have, a once in a lifetime opportunity to make this site connect better, particularly because the Stillaguamish tribe was able to purchase the property upstream adjacent to us. So we had the ability to connect another 300-acre parcel to ours and to have a comprehensive restoration, plan together so that would be hydrodynamically synergistic. And then they were able to just purchase another 500 acres next to that. And so suddenly we have this delta that has been straitjacketed for a century, and we're able to like break it open again. Whether the fish come back right away is, they've got a lot of adversity ahead of them, but there's not a lot we can do about the ocean.
Yeah.
But we can do a lot in the estuary, and we know that's a really critical life stage. So it feels good to be part of that, I guess.
Can you talk about your partnership or the work that you've done in partnership with the tribal groups? Because I read that in some of the materials that I had used to prepare for this, and I'd love to hear more about how TNC and the tribal groups have worked together on any aspect of it. I mean, I thought that was really cool that they were able to secure those properties that adjoin to the preserve. Can you talk more about that partnership?
Yeah, so we have been working with the Stillaguamish tribe primarily as neighbors with their recent acquisitions, and as we've been on partner proposals with the Stillaguamish tribe and other entities as well as we've gone for public grant money together. And so some of the restoration funds that we were able to get were part of the same grant package that helped them with some land purchases and restoration projects that came from the bipartisan infrastructure funding, which was really quite galvanizing in terms of its scale of how much we could suddenly just dream of. And so but the property that's right next to us that Stille owns, they have a partnership with the Tulalip tribes just down the way in the Snohomish. So they're helping to project manage. The Tulalips are helping to project manage the design and construction of we call it Zizaba 2, which is right next to us. And Zizaba was a Stillaguamish chief who had fishing villages down in the Delta prior to it being turned to farmland. And so the Stillaguamish tribes' usual and custom area for fishing rights ends at the mouth of the river. And the Tulalip tribe's fishing area then sort of picks up out in the bay. And, there's some ambiguity about where do those end and overlap, because it's tidal, of course, which makes it tricky. And then to the north, we work a lot with the Skagit River System Co-op, which is a natural resource sort of government entity in service of the Swinomish tribe and the Upper Sauk-Suatal tribes. And so we work with that team for a lot of the science effort that we are putting into the monitoring of fish in the Stille. Part of that's because there's a lot of Skagit fish that actually come in, and we have got a big body of genetic data that show the levels of mixing. So when the Skagit is booming in terms, has a really good outmigration year for juvenile Chinook, they overcrowd each other, and a bunch of them will spill over into the Stillaguamish. And so we'll get the Stillaguamish can kind of catch those big years and help support them. And so there's a lot of mixing and sharing and partnerships trying to figure out how can we all support each other through this crash of the fish, but also new opportunities for restoration. And yeah, it's great because the tribes work from the mountains to the ocean, and so we get really, I'm, mostly an estuary ecologist. And so it's neat for me to be able to expand my understanding of, everything that's happening for these fish all the way down the river.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've really loved about these TNC interviews that I've been doing is that kind of across the board from what you're doing down on the coast all the way to the plains of the Dakotas where they're doing a lot of bison restoration, there really seems to be this push to really, really, really intentionally involve the tribal groups and really get their generational knowledge and include that in some of this really hardcore science and really find these outside the box solutions that seem to be super effective. It's been really inspiring for me to just hear about all these different things going on. Another partner that I'd love to hear about is in my old, many lifetimes ago, I was in the real estate business in North Carolina. And I remember I worked with some people that did some stuff on the coast. And I remember, I didn't work on any of it directly, but I just remember hearing if you start messing with the coast, you've got to get the Army Corps of Engineers involved, and it gets very complicated very quickly. And do you guys have to partner much with the federal government on these projects when you're messing, when you're trying to not straighten out, but make the river channels more complex again? I mean, how much does the government play a role in everything that y'all are doing?
Yeah, they play a really large role. For our particular project, though, because we were the last property at the toe of the river, our particular project had very little impact on anyone else's lands in terms of flooding and flood risk or infrastructure risk. And so unlike projects that are maybe, in the upper Mississippi with levee setbacks and things that really do need to partner closely with the Army Corps, we are more, my experience, was that we were more just in the permit space. And so through our funding by NOAA and National Coastal Wetlands and a number of other funding entities, we would luckily be, assigned someone from the agency to kind of help us with some of the permitting aspects. But there's county permits, there's state permits, there's federal permits, there's some that are associated with the biological impacts as opposed to the hydraulic impacts. And there's certainly cultural resource permits. So there's the permitting component is actually one of the most stressful pieces of putting a restoration project in the ground.
Yeah, I would think so.
And it's time consuming, and there's circularities between the agencies, and because, I think partly because the bipartisan infrastructure money is pouring through at breakneck speed and size, there's a huge bottleneck in the permitting space. There's just not enough people to handle them all. And so, we didn't get our last permit in hand till an hour before, we were supposed to go to construction, and we had everybody on site. There were probably 30 people standing on site, to have the breaking ground meeting of cultural resource people and the fish people and the diking district people and the construction people and the engineers and everybody. And, we're just waiting for that email to come through. Come on. Everyone's biting their fingernails, and, for, the team that's actually doing the work, they're just looking at these giant floating excavators that they built on site, and, they aren't moving. They're not working. They're not making money. They're just costing money to sit in the dust. So you kind of look at those things and think, oh my gosh, how much are we going to spend a day to not do anything while we wait for our permits to come through? But they did. But
That's
I think
awesome.
it's a tricky one to figure out how to, streamline permits so that, I one of the things after we came through that whole project, we were kind of, you kind of get flattened by the whole thing because it's just so much all at the same time, and thinking like, man, I see why people burn out, and if we lose practitioners, I bet it's because of the permits.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's just the reality. And when you just think about the size of the federal government, I mean, I think it's nobody's at fault. Nobody's doing anything wrong. It's just it's such a massive beast that it does take that time. I mean, when I was doing full-time conservation, I applied for a few NRCS grants, and I've been to several different conferences. We're bringing together the conservation groups and the NRCS to try to figure out ways to speed up the process. And everybody is super well-intentioned. Everybody's really smart, but it's just it's just a huge process. And in order for it to be done right, it's going to take time. So I can't imagine that kind of suspenseful moment of waiting for that thing to come in. I would have been throwing stuff around. I wouldn't have been able to stay calm. So when you think looking forward, we're still thinking about the Port Susan Bay Preserve. What are some kind of goals you have or best case scenarios, things that you would like, say, in the next 5 years? What some measures of success that would make you feel great if you look back?
Yeah, so I'm right in the middle of writing up that monitoring plan. So one of the things that we had noticed in the data leading up to this were that the plants, like all the emergent sedges that are sort of, they're submersed on the high tide and they're, all the way dried out in the low tide. These plants are all living at the very edge of their physiological limits, right? It's not where they prefer to be necessarily, it's where they get pushed to. And so really small shifts in salinity or water level or temperature can really change the composition or sort of the health of estuarine plants, because they're all just living on the edge. And what we had noticed was in 2015, that was the year the blob set up in the Pacific Ocean, and
Yes.
It was a big El Nino year, and there was very little snowpack, which will connect us to what we're doing later in this discussion.
I feel like you're looking at my notes, like you're going directly down my notes.
So this is what kicked my, brain into thinking about snowpack. But that year, this was, I guess it was the year before I started working for the Nature Conservancy, but the ecologist who I had been an intern under, Roger Fuller, was still there. And so he'd kind of compiled the data before handing the baton off on this site to me. And what he had noticed was that the plants failed to set seed that summer. They were susceptible to a moth that bores into the stems of the plants, and they all senesced really early. And the biomass they produced that year was about a third normal. So we measure plant height on these vegetation transects every summer. And so we began to think like, okay, that was the first major, we called it a snow drought that year, when the plants were hammered by July. And so one of the sort of looking back, what we were hoping to do with this restoration project was to connect the river more to these northern marshes of the Delta that Roger had been observing was, retreating towards the dike at anywhere between 5 and 25 meters a year, depending on where you were along the Delta. And so the sediments of the river and the fresh water from the river, they were just shunting south out of the Stillaguamish River through those dikes and then dumping off into the deep water of the bay rather than sweeping across the whole of the Delta through a series of distributary channels. So one of the things that we can look at over time is, do we see the marsh starting to prograde back out away from the dike once we get this restoration done? That would be hopeful. But of course, now we have sea level rise, at the same time. But the Stillaguamish is one of the very few rivers that is not dammed. And so it has a really good sediment supply. And so we have another team from Western Washington University, John Ribzick's crew. They're called they set out set tables or sediment elevation measurements. And so they actually measure how much sediment is accreting or building up on the marsh surface year by year. And so far, it's been keeping up with sea level rise, but it's definitely barely keeping up in the northern parts of this bay and delta. So if we can pick up a shift in sediment accretion rates as a result of our restoration projects, we'll be very, very happy. And then I think the last thing that we're looking for is thinking about how juvenile Chinook move throughout the delta, and are we seeing them spread out into these habitats that they used to not be able to get to very easily because the dikes were in the way. And now we've built a channel network for them to get there more easily so they can make use of more of the delta. And because they have both the river and the bay waters sloshing around, that creates a mosaic of salinities and temperatures. And fish are really proactive about where they want to be to get growth. So there's like the University of Washington's Alaska Salmon Program. They documented, this is Johnny Armstrong's research, that little coho salmon will move a mile downstream. These guys are like 3 inches long to eat sockeye eggs and then move back upstream to digest it because it was warmer upstream. And they could digest the eggs in like 3 days, whereas the eggs were all laid downstream where it's cold to keep the eggs oxygenated. And so these little guys were like, well, if I stay down there, it would have taken 14 days to digest one bellyful. But if they make the mile crossing, they can actually increase their growth rates because they're like strategizing between food availability and temperature. And so we are doing a bioenergetic study down in the Stillaguamish Delta to understand how the restoration is going to impact growth potential as a result of our restoration design plans, to see whether we can give these Chinooks some advantages of, hey, sometimes it's going to be too hot, but also sometimes these deltas are too cold from all the snowmelt and they need warmer places. So the more connection points, the better they are able to make choices that are advantageous for their own growth.
Yeah, one of the notes I had from one of your writings was robust and fragile. And I think that speaks to that idea that these plants and animals, they are very robust. They can kind of change as needed, but then the whole environment can be very, very fragile at the same time, which is pretty cool to think about. One follow-up question on that. You were talking about sea level rise, the sea level rising. This may be a very dumb question, but I'm not scared to ask dumb questions. How much is the sea level there rising? Like, is it the kind of thing where it's, pretty significant? Because I hear that term all the time, but I've never actually talked to a scientist who studies it. What's the deal with the sea level rising there?
Oh, goodness. And this is where I'm going to say, I can't remember what the rate is, and I'm going to get it wrong if I say it.
Okay, but it's measurable.
It is measurable on like the order of, centimeters per, every 5 years or so.
Really?
But the tricky thing about the Salish Sea is that it was once glaciated. And so when the glaciers melted after the Ice Age, they were so heavy that the ground was actually rising too. So it's called isostatic rebound. And so in parts of the Salish Sea where the glaciers were thicker, it's rising at a faster rate than in other areas where they were not quite as thick. And so saying what the sea level rise rate is, or the relative sea level rise, because you've got this isostatic rebound happening at the same time, it gets tricky. So I would always get it wrong. So I'm not going to give you a number.
No, I appreciate that. That's why you're a scientist. I'm not, because I'd just be like spouting, somewhere in this area, which is not very scientific. All right. So we're going to move up into the Cascades now and hear about some of the snowpack stuff. Can you give, you mentioned this earlier, but the 2015 El Nino year and the snow drought, can you talk more about that? Because I spent 3 months there in the Pacific Northwest, and the last thing I would ever call it is dry and drought prone. And so can you talk about maybe the difference between snow drought and I guess just regular drought, and then and what that 2015 event kind of triggered as far as everybody's awareness of how fragile things can be when it comes to the snowpack?
Yeah, so Washington State is, right on the Pacific Ocean, right? So we get all these big moist storms that come first crashing into the Olympic Mountains and then crash into the Cascade Mountains. And so a lot of moisture drops on the west slopes of these mountains, like out on the Pacific coast side of the Olympics in the town of Forks. You can get 11 feet of snow, of rain per year. And then you get to the eastern slopes of the Cascades, like out near Yakima, and you might get 11 inches of rain a year. So there's really strong precipitation gradients across the state because of the mountains and the way they, air masses smack into them, get too heavy to get up and over, so drop all the precipitation, and then shift out down the eastern slopes, whereas not only do they already drop all their moisture, but as the cloud, the air masses move down slope, they warm up, and that sucks moisture out of the air, out of the trees, out of the soil. So you can get really dry on the eastern slopes of these mountain ranges. So for, on the western slopes, we get a mix of rain and snow. Certainly above a certain elevation, you get the shift to snow. And on the eastern slopes, it's mostly reliant on snow. All of the eastern Cascades river basins, like the Wenatchee and the Methow and the Yakima and the Natchez, they are dependent upon snowpack for upwards of 75% of all the surface water in those river systems.
Okay.
They're not going to get anything from rain. It's all going to come from snow. And so it all has to happen in the winter. And that's where the water is stored and sort of metered out over the course of the year. And so a snow drought was when it was a warm year. El Nino years tend to be warm. And you get a lot of precipitation and, a change in temperature, a very small change in temperature is the difference between snow and rain. And so we got a ton of precipitation that year, but it just wasn't quite cold enough. And so it would snow, then it would pour down rain on top of it, and all the snow would melt away. And that year, there were billions of dollars of agricultural crop losses on the eastern slopes of the Cascades, sort of stone fruits, cherry orchards, apricots, peaches. And those are crops that you can't fallow for the year because they're a tree. And so I think, that was one of the first years where junior water rights owners really got hit hard. And I think now we're looking at the climate change by the 2050s, 2080s, like 70% of the years will be drought, and junior water rights owners will have to, be cutting back in the amount of water they can use, which really changes what you can grow because you need to be ready to truncate your irrigation at any point in time. And so the more expensive, high cost crops like cherries are not something that those growers are probably able to really think about keeping on anymore.
Yeah, that's crazy to think about. Obviously it makes perfect sense when you say it, but it's one of those things that I'd never really thought about up until, but then when I was preparing for this, I saw a note in something I read that said there's been a 41 decrease in annual snow mass since 1982, with snow season shortened by 34 days. And so that's definitely not headed in the right direction. So talk to me about some of the work y'all are doing with forest and snowpack and, figuring out how these gaps in the forest can help to either make the snowpack hang around a little bit longer, or some of the other things you've discovered through this work with forest management.
Yeah, so I was introduced to Dr. Susan Dickerson Lang. She's a snow hydrologist, and she works for a consulting firm called Natural Systems Designs, and they do a lot of restoration work. And she had done her dissertation at UW at the Mountain Hydrology Lab on this topic of looking at the gaps and closed canopy forests and trying to understand, what the dynamics were there, of whether kind of the gaps are good for water or not so good. And so she and I got to talking, and I kind of said, well, I just started the Nature Conservancy, and they've most recently kind of helped purchase, and as part of this big was the Western Checkerboards project. So trying to kind of re-piece together the checkerboard of the forests, and part of the purchase properties are in the headwaters of the Yakima near Cle-Elum, and there's 48,000 acres there, and most of that, sort of forest management was really thinking about fire and wildfire. And she said, a lot of the fire practices are gaps, and I have this research on gaps. And, sometimes gaps are great for protecting snowpack and sometimes they're not. And it's really dependent upon where you are. And so one thing we wanted to make sure of was that we weren't borrowing restoration techniques from one region and transferring them inappropriately to another, because the snow response to tree gaps and thinning was really different depending on where you are at the sort of bigger regional scale and global scales. But where we had no data and where TNC had land were the eastern slopes of the Cascades. And because of that really strong climatic gradient, they're a really tricky place to model and predict what snow response to tree forest structure is going to be. And so Susan and I started this project looking at snow response to open canopy gaps and closed places. And what we did is we took, a pairs of sites that, sort of went from the western slopes of the Cascades up and over the crest and then back down the other side. And we paired them with these snowtell sites that are a government program that keeps track of what the snowpack is all throughout the American West. I mean, there's like 500 or 800 snowtell sites, and they're all set up with these great meteorological, weather stations. So you can get a lot of data out of them, but every single one of them is in a gap. And so we put a bunch of monitoring poles in closed canopy forests right next to these various snowtell sites. And then we could look and see what happens under the tree canopy over the course of a winter, which is something you can't get from a satellite image. They can't tell what's happening under the tree, but we can see what's going on down below. And so what we found was sure enough, west slopes, it's a bit warmer there. The snow is a little bit sticky. The branches are really thick because there's water, so the trees are lush. And if you open up a gap there, you really do get a lot more snow building up on the forest floor. And it can last, up to 3 weeks long, or 3 months longer in some cases. So it's a really good strategy on the west slopes if you're, in a snow drought situation. And it's more reminiscent of, how old growth forests once looked, right? There would be big gaps. Gap dynamics is a big thing in forest ecology, and particularly for old growth. As we moved into the Central Cascades and then into on the eastern slopes, we found a different pattern, which is that you open up the canopy gap and you absolutely get more snow building up on the forest floor, but it is balanced out by a faster melt rate because it's sunnier. And so it's warm, so the snow's a little sticky. You still have that interception effect of the canopy, but the solar radiation on the eastern slopes is just quite a bit higher than on the west side where it's always cloudy and rainy. And so we found that you could certainly build up a deeper snowpack, but you didn't get that duration effect as much until we zeroed in on, what happens if we do the same project on the north and the south side of a ridge? And when we zero into that level, we were able to see that actually, you can get snow lasting 2 weeks to a month longer on the north side of the ridges, with snow building up nearly twice as deep in the gaps compared to the closed canopy areas. And so that's a really promising way to help water supplies in these dry side basins, particularly if I put my fish salmon lens on. Juvenile salmon that leave the sort of Cle-Elum River area, if they don't get out of there by the end of May, they don't make it down the Yakima River to the Columbia. 95% of them die in the lower Yakima because it's so warm and the water is so slowly moving through all the dams, and the predators that are invasive, like set up in those reservoirs. And since the water's warm, their metabolism is really fast and they're hungry. And so the salmon don't make it. And so if you can keep snow on the landscape pushing cold water through that system by extra 2 weeks or a month, like that's actually meaningful. Not so meaningful for those who, are thinking about late season irrigation, but for ESA listed salmon, that's a meaningful amount of time.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a lot, like a whole lot of time, and very significant. So when you find out this information, it sounds pretty clear and also very promising. Then what do you do with it? Like, do you work with the Forest Service? How does it go from making this discovery, understanding kind of the best case scenario for the way a forest should be managed, into putting that into practice?
The cool thing about the Nature Conservancy is they're very well connected. Yes. And they work in a lot of directions at the same time. So when we started developing this project, we talked with what's called the Tuppish Forest Collaborative. So there's Forest Collaboratives throughout the state, and the Tuppish is particularly in the sort of Yakima area. And it is a compilation of leaders from the Yakima Nation, the Nature Conservancy, DNR, Forest Service, and Department of Fish and Wildlife. So when we started the research initially, it was in conversation with the Tuppish Forest Collaborative team. And DNR has subsequently helped fund project along the way, and most recently was funding a Ph.D. student in Jessica Lundquist's lab. Her name is Cassie Lombrazzo. She just finished in December, which I'm very excited for her. And so we're connected with DNR in that way, and they're really the leaders in developing the forest management plans for the state and implementing a lot of the fire work. And so what we were trying to do is to really, we know that all these landscapes are high wildfire risk, that DNR is leading the way using, collaborative science that TNC helped develop with them, what the forest treatments should look like to be both, improve forest health, but also reduce wildfire risk and create, go back to a wildfire adapted forest. So we were kind of using those prescriptions to guide our interpretation of our work. So the part that Cassie was working on was a secondary, the second phase of our project, where I think it was Phil Rigdon from the Yakima Nation, and he said, well, that's great that you're looking at gaps and forest canopies, but I need to be able to tell if, my forestry team, this is the prescription, this level of thinning, is that going to be different from this other level of thinning? And so the Nature Conservancy was already putting in and planning for thinning projects on Cle Elum Ridge. And so we worked with our forestry team to put in different levels of thinning on the north side, like a whole range, and then this, another range of thinning levels on the south side of the ridge, so that we could track the different snow response depending on thinning level and slope aspect. And so that was, very much came straight from, Phil Rigdon's and his forestry department saying, well, this is what would actually be helpful. So we've been trying to do that translation. And it's interesting because foresters work on a metric called, because they look at the trunks, right? Basal area factor, BAF. And research snowpack people really care about the canopy, and we're using LiDAR. So Cassie was able to get she got a grant from NASA to get the first snow on LiDAR in Washington State, and then the second snow on LiDAR, but a drone based out of the UW's rapid response team.
Wait, hold on. What's LiDAR?
LiDAR is laser something detection and ranging. So basically you shoot lasers from an airplane,
okay,
or a drone in this case as well, and the laser goes down and it bounces back up when it hits something. And so it can hit off branches, but sometimes it can hit all the way down to the ground. And so the state has LiDAR that really gives you the topography at the ground level. Really, they would ramp this up to after the Oso landslide on the Still River, actually, to look landslide potential across the state. But anyway, so now we have all this ground-based LiDAR that gives you this slope topography. And then if you fly LiDAR with a snow on it, it'll bounce off the surface of the snow, and you can take the difference between those two and get the depth of the snow.
Oh, cool.
So you can get they're huge data sets. There's, millions of point clouds, all different elevations of these lasers that are being shot down from the airplane, bounce off something, and then are detected when they bounce back up. So she has these great snowpack depths. And so trying to take the LiDAR data and translate it into a metric that is relatable to those basal area factors that a forester would use is like, it's a language barrier.
Yeah, sure.
Like those two methods of thinking about the forest, because the LiDAR is not picking up trunk width. So we're doing the best we can on that one, but it is interesting to see that there are some discernible patterns across the gradient of treatments that we've put in, sort of thinning levels. And yeah, Northside still performing. Her data preliminarily are showing, on the south slopes is where things could get tricky. And depending on the way in which we handle the LiDAR data, it's either sort of a neutral effect of how, like when snow melts out, or you could actually get less snow overall building up on the south slopes in treated areas. Where on the north slopes, it's very consistent. You always do better with thinning, which is good news, right? Because this landscape no longer looks like it once did when it was fire adapted. It's much denser forest than it ever had been pre-colonization by Europeans.
And that's mostly attributed to commercial logging at some point when they came and took out the old growth forest. And then when they replanted it much, much, much thicker than it had been ever before. Is that right?
It's a combination of that as well as fire suppression.
Yeah.
So that 100-year fire suppression policy really allowed small, non-fire adapted trees to kind of fill in, and also to create ladder fuels from the ground to the high canopy of the big old trees that do still exist. And so, now we have this sort of carpet of trees, whereas fires would have swept through and taken out many of the seedlings and younger trees, over pretty rapid fire cycles, actually, on the eastern slopes at least.
I always recommend people read Timothy Egan's book, The Big Burn, to understand that, because I feel like anytime on this podcast we talk about fire, the idea of fire suppression comes up, and I feel like that book is gives some really good history and background on exactly how we got to where we are now with this idea of fire suppression. And I'm obsessed with Theodore Roosevelt, but that's definitely one of the things that he screwed up. I'd love to hear, if you don't mind sharing, I'd love to hear about your personal journey to doing this work, because we talked a bit yesterday, and we were talking about all the stuff that we both love to do outdoors, from sailing to climbing up big mountains. And so when you were a kid, at what point did you realize that you wanted to be a scientist, if you did when you were a kid?
I think as a kid, I remember my goal as a kid was that I wanted to have a small farm with a bunch of animals, kids, and a pond, or something where I could jump in the water.
Sounds like a plan to me.
I remember saying, like, why do you have to be something big? I just want to, be good.
You're a wise child.
I don't know. I feel like I have enough grant reporting to do right now that I think I failed on that one. But I do have the chickens, I do have the kids, and got a dog, but the goats never happened. But yeah, we did a lot of outdoor time and play as a kid. We spent a lot of time in the mountains backpacking. We spent a lot of time out in eastern Washington. My dad did a lot of bird hunting, and so we spent time out in sagebrush and smashing around in marshes. Bushwhacking is a key trait of being a hunter, and then we spent a lot of time out on the water in the summers sailing. My grandparents had sailed on the Great Lakes, and when I was about in middle school or so, they had the boat trucked out to Washington. And so that's when my family started sailing her out here. And so, yeah, I think we've, growing up here, we always were out in it and also harvesting from it. And I think it was, one of our favorite hunting places was on the Wenatchee River drainage on the White River, and hunting season is salmon spawning season. And so the place where we would go was where the sockeye run would come through. And, it was one of those classic stories where, the fish really were like a carpet across the river, and you could wade through it and pet them or have them bump into your ankles. There were so many. And then, over time, the benefit of going back to the same place every year is you watch those changes, and they dwindled away, and to the point where when I take my kids there, we're hard pressed to find 2 or 3 pairs of spawners.
And it's not like that. We're the same age, and that was not that long ago, or at least it doesn't seem like it to me.
Yeah, no, it's really not that long ago. It was a pretty precipitous drop. And so that was happening, right when I was, going to college. And I always took a lot of the biology classes. And my grandfather was a shellfish biologist at Woods Hole and in the summers. And so there's like some science in my genes to be sure. But I remember doing a project on like forests and salmon in college, and it was right during the timber wars when the last of the old growth was, really under pressure, and the spotted owl had been listed, and that was when I decided like I need to go home. I was in Vermont for college, and that's what I need to do for my life. Like, I don't know. It's just very clear all of a sudden.
Man, I'm jealous of that. I still have no idea what I'm going to do when I grow up. Well, that's cool. Well, I'm so glad you're doing this work because it's so important. And that area where you're doing all this work is just so special on so many levels. I love it so much. And in talking to you and getting ready for this, I really need to get back out there and see it all because I just really, really miss it. I love books. And since you're a super smart scientist, I'm sure you've read tons and tons and tons of books, but I was wondering if there are any particular ones that come to mind that it doesn't necessarily have to be about ecology or about science or about the West, but really any books that have played a big role in your personal evolution and your career and just kind of making you the person you are. Do you have any recommendations for the listeners?
Yes, anything by Barbara Kingsolver.
Oh, my wife's gone through, she's read like 2 in the last month, I think. I think she's got a new novel out. I can't remember what it was. My wife was just glued to it. Loves Kingsolver.
Yes, Demon Copperhead. It's good.
Yes, that's
really a look into, Appalachia and the opioid crisis. And she just has a way of drawing you right into a community to feel what it's like, different, just different perspectives. And she helps you love the characters as they go through really hard things. And it's something that sort of has a thread throughout all of her books. I find that and I think as a conservationist, actually, it's really helpful because we get set up as adversaries. Estuarine restoration and farming can be tough, and so just having that empathy. We're all just trying to do the best we can.
I agree.
I think the other one that's really been sitting in my heart lately is Braiding Sweetgrass. And I think one of the, I think I work a lot with tribes, but we use, mostly the natural resource staff are non-tribal. And so we have we're in service of the tribes, but we work mostly in Western science, and I don't have a lot of interaction actually with tribal members. And so Braiding Sweetgrass it was a really nice book for me to read to see how she weaves her indigenous knowledge with her life as a Western trained botanist. And there was one piece in there where she's describing having gone out to Oregon. She's out on the headlands where there's indigenous burning happens on the headlands to support, I think it was camas. It happens at the time of year when the salmon are returning and their salmon are coming home. And she has this piece in there where she's describing all the biologists, tromping around in their waders in the mud, slogging through, damp, pouring down rain with her notebooks. And she describes those notebooks as the data as being love letters to salmon, and a way of bridging that species divide where we no longer have the way to like converse directly, which in indigenous cultures at one point they could. And so the data are the way in which we try to listen. And I hadn't had words through my career to talk about how I think about the science I do, but she nailed it. And it was so relieving to have someone give me words for what I feel like I'm doing. But that stuff doesn't come out in a scientific publication, right? You don't have science writing, scientific, publication level writing. You strip out your whole soul. And so you can't really bring those philosophies into it, even though that's what the work is. And so it was just, I don't know, that book really gave me a lot of peace. Like, okay, she thinks what we're doing is okay too. If my data are love letters to salmon, I'm a happy person.
I'll tell you, that book, that very well may be the most recommended book on this podcast, at least over the last like 3 or 4 years. It comes up so often, and I still have not read it. And one of your colleagues sent it to me as well, and I still have not read it. It's sitting right on my shelf. I need to make that happen. I apologize. I say that every time, and I haven't read it yet.
It'll be waiting for you.
And then that brings up a blog post that I read about some of your work that I'll link to, and the name is escaping me right now, but I'll link to it. And there was it combined, it was a description of a lot of the work you're doing, which was so interesting, but then it actually combined poetry into the post. Yeah. And I thought I really appreciated the way that you and your team are coming up with ways to tell these stories about all this really intense scientific work you're doing, but putting it out in a way that connects with people on all different levels, whether it's just narrative storytelling, explaining it to somebody like me who's curious but is not a scientist, to even more on the art side of things with poetry. I love that.
Yeah, that was Leah Palmer. She's joined our team fairly recently in the last year or so, and she is indigenous from sort of the Oklahoma area. And we had long conversations about water and what water means to us, and just thinking about how do we evoke emotion, like the emotion that we have associated with our work, into something. And so that came from her heart.
Well, it was really, really well done. I loved reading it, and I'll have a link in the episode notes so people can click through and you can actually listen to her read the poem, which I thought was super cool. Final question for you, and then I'll let you get back to your important work and quit being so gracious as I ask you all these crazy questions. What any kind of parting words of wisdom for the people that listen to this podcast? Conservation is a big part of one of my focuses here on the podcast. And as we were talking about yesterday, I'm very curious about the specific projects that people are working on, but I'm also even more curious about kind of the mindset that people like you have as they go about this super important purpose-driven work. And so any kind of parting words of wisdom for the listeners?
I think for me, it is about patience and having patience. I think we often expect a lot from a little. We often expect things to happen on our timelines. And I think some of the urgency of the various conservation issues we're facing, whether it be climate change or habitat loss or what have you, we can put in a lot of things now, but we should recognize that, at least in the United States, right, we're looking at 200 years of kind of messing around with this landscape, and, have patience if things don't recover right away. Like, we're just starting to chip at the recovery while we're also rolling things out, with more roads, whatever, at the same time. So patience is good. Don't give up.
I need that. I need to get that like tattooed on my arm, patience, because that's not my strong suit, but I agree. It's so important. And I love this conversation. I'm really, really thankful for you and all the work you're doing. When we were talking yesterday, it became clear that the Port Susan Bay Preserve is actually just a few miles from where I was based when I was on Knowles back in 1999. And so it's just, I love that area. Obviously, I love TNC, and I'm just such a fan of everything y'all are doing. So thank you for your work and for taking the time to chat with me.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me and helping us tell our story, because it can be tricky amidst all the proposals and reporting and whatever else we're doing. So really appreciate chatting with you.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way, so head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.